And good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Monday, the 30th of June, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Hard to believe this year is already halfway over. With that, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here. Starting with this latest big, beautiful bill, I guess that is in various stages now of either being cleared by the Senate or being reconciled with the House bill. And I think Jared, correct me if I'm wrong. I think they wanted to get that done by July 4th, and I guess that's still on track. So the end of the week.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks. The Congressional Budget Office released a new estimate on Friday, just an estimate that's based on the Senate version of this bill, saying that they now expect this big, beautiful bill to add $3.3 trillion in debt over the next 10 years. And that's a preliminary projection. We're going to follow up on some other projections. The biggest thing, the national debt, I think, takes a backseat to the deficit. The deficit is what they really have to get control over. This is something that Ray Dalio talked about last week. He's a hedge fund manager. I cite him frequently because he's been talking about this stuff. He's a credible voice. He's very plain spoken, and I think his interest is in the United States avoiding a debt crisis. But one of the things he says is that these people have to get the federal deficit down from 6% to 3%. And I'm not sure that this big, beautiful bill is going to do that, A. But B, Moody's came out in the past couple of weeks, and they said they expect the federal deficit to worsen in the next 10 years to 9%. And 9% in 10 years, when you start to look at the increased costs of borrowing, it's probably one reason why Ray Dalio says he thinks there's at least an 80% chance of a debt crisis within the next 10 years. At any rate, we'll follow up on this. Also, the Senate in this bill settled on some regulations. We previously talked about state-level AI regulations, and there's some states that want to regulate AI, like California. And in this big, beautiful bill, the Senate agreed to, they had initially proposed a 10-year ban on states being able to regulate AI, and that is coming down now to a 5-year pause on all state-level regulations for artificial intelligence. And the provision will have exemptions for, quote, state laws that protect kids, creators, and other vulnerable individuals from the unintended consequences of AI. Also, President Trump sent a letter to a number of countries that have not yet completed a tariff deal with the United States, and Trump apparently intends to assign tariff rates to each country. And we'll follow up and see exactly what that means. Moving on, the Secretary of Energy, Wright, published an opinion piece on Friday calling for an end to calling for the passage of the big, beautiful bill because it will eliminate green tax credits and make, quote, much needed investments in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. On Friday, over on the Early Warning Network platform, we did say that the Trump administration, the White House at least, said that they have no plans to fill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, even at reduced oil prices. And it's something we're also looking at. Moving on here, the Energy Department announced on Friday that it was withdrawing from the Columbia River System Memorandum of Understanding, and that MOU requires the federal government to replace, or at least previously required, the federal government to replace several functioning dams with other electrical generation services there on the Columbia River. Department of Energy states that this will maintain 3,000 megawatts of power, continue providing water to local farmers, and save $31 billion in replacement costs. And all this is in an effort to keep energy prices lower. And finally, the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Justice announced a new process on Friday that allows illegal aliens to skip the 30-day notice, or to skip their 30-day notice, and that applies to these federal agencies. This new process is going to apply to everyone who enters into the U.S. illegally, and those who do that also who ignore removal orders and fail to honor voluntary departure orders. Again, this new rule would allow DHS to skip that 30-day notice. DHS says, quote, financial penalties like these are just one more reason why illegal aliens should use CBP Home to self-deport now before it's too late. And with that, let's jump into the global sitrep. Jared, good morning.
Morning.
I'll let you take it away. Go ahead.
Sounds good. So the Israel Defense Forces believe that Iran is going to shift focus from destabilizing, uh, Lebanon, Syria, all the rest, into destabilizing Jordan. Now, this is to become a new platform for all of Iran's proxies, per the IDF. The IDF believes that the security cooperation that they have with Jordan will be insufficient in order to address this new axis of threat, and they have, to that end, they have mobilized a new division to deploy to this border. Uh, Staying on Iran, the Iranian chief of the general staff of the Iranian armed forces told Saudi Arabia's defense minister over the weekend that Iran, quote, has serious doubts about respecting Israel's commitments, including the ceasefire. They're saying that they don't expect Israel to maintain the ceasefire at all, and that Iran is ready to respond in the event that they do. Moving much closer to home, the Office of the Inspector General released an audit just this month, and in it, they say that the FBI reported back in 2018 the Sinaloa cartel had hired someone to break into the phone of an FBI assistant legal attaché working with the U.S. Embassy down in Mexico City, and that cartel hacker then used that information to monitor the phone's location, cross-reference it with Mexico City's street surveillance cameras, which he also had access to, and thereby identify government informants, which, being that it's Cartel, they took care of the government informants from there.
Jared, just real briefly on that. Yeah, this is nuts, to use a technical term. I watched a documentary once about cartels. They went through and they kidnapped a bunch of telecommunications workers for like the national carriers. They literally just went to these cell towers and kidnapped them, and then kidnapped a bunch of other people. And they forced them to work and help the cartels build their own, I guess, somewhat covert communication system. And it just goes to show that these cartels, in many cases, have capabilities that borderline on a nation state when they go and do these things. So it's a pretty interesting story there, Jared. I mean, that is something that this story about identifying government informants is a counterintelligence function, and we're seeing quasi-state level counterintelligence capabilities here exhibited by the cartels.
Yeah, I do want to reiterate that this is a report coming out now that on an incident that happened in 2018, 7 years ago. So this is likely a mature tactic that they have at this point.
Certainly.
Now, moving over, the United States Treasury Department lifted sanctions on several major Russian companies that are all related to Russian civil nuclear energy late last week. This actually is going to allow Russia to move forward with a power plant in Hungary, a major NATO ally. So I think we're going to see a lot more ingress for Russian energy dominance in the European sphere again.
All right, thanks for that. Yeah, there's a lot of wheeling and dealing over the past week or so. President Trump says he wants to reduce sanctions, provide sanctions relief for Iran if they stay peaceful. It's another case of seeking to remove some sanctions for Russia in return, obviously in return for some peace deal in Ukraine. So thanks for that, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on to today's In Focus section here. So I spent 2 days last week talking about the potential for a civil war, and just for everyone, I think the probability now is obviously quite low. That said, we do have this low intensity conflict that's been raging in the background. Just for those who are unaffiliated, low intensity conflict is an umbrella term, and it describes conflict that is beneath the threshold of conventional war. So we're not talking about tanks and bombers. It's not a high intensity conflict like World War II or Russia, Ukraine, but it exists above routine peaceful competition. So we're not simply in a period of business as usual. This is actually, it is an actual conflict, low intensity conflict. And again, it's an umbrella term that describes everything from violent social movements on the low side. So BLM riots, for instance, was a violent social movement, up to terrorism, popular revolutions, guerrilla warfare, Popular revolution just means predominantly nonviolent revolutions like Euromaidan, for instance, in Ukraine. And again, there's some level, obviously, of violence that's going to take place, but we're not talking about organized political violence. We're not talking about an armed revolution. All the way, low intensity conflict continues, like guerrilla warfare, secessionist movements, breakaway regions, etc., all the way up to insurgency and counterinsurgency. And we have, over the past 20 years in this country, seen almost all of those, or at least attempts at almost all of those. So, point being, last week, I hope I explained the case that while civil war is possible in the somewhat foreseeable future, I think obviously the longer you go, the more likely it becomes. But the United States remains locked in a period of low intensity conflict. And a lot of this conflict is the direct result of diametrically opposing visions for the future of this country. And namely, it is socialism versus capitalism. I remember that 2016 interview with Ray Dalio, the hedge fund manager, at Davos, at the World Economic Forum. And he was interviewed on CNBC, and he said, yeah, I think the United States is headed for civil war. And that was the first time that I had ever heard of Ray Dalio, but I started looking into him. And since then, has written several fantastic books about how some of these things will come about. He's mainly looking at the financial and economic side. And I'll share with you, I'll reiterate some of his conclusions here in just a second. But over the past roughly 10 years, we have seen the rise of democratic socialism as a minor player, but still a significant player in U.S. politics. And most recently, it started with the presidential candidacy of Bernie Sanders in 2016. And then you get the rise of the relative rise of the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, as a political entity, followed by the election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Democratic Socialist Squad to Congress. And now most recently to the self-identified Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani and his Democratic primary victory in the New York City mayoral race. In a video that surfaced over the weekend, Mamdani is seen as encouraging support for, quote, the end goal of seizing the means of production. And that is a revolutionary Marxist concept that would ban private ownership of businesses and more in favor of a, quote unquote, democratic ownership by the masses. And under this vision, it is the workers, not CEOs or the management, who would have the direct say in how that business was run. Now, the Democratic Socialist political insurgency within the Democratic Party has for years unsuccessfully tried to wrestle power from the establishment party leadership. And I think 2016 is just a fantastic view into exactly how that has gone for the Democratic Socialists, i.e. not well. But it may, this attempted political insurgency within the Democratic Party may not be unsuccessful for too much longer. Because given Mamdani's path to mayoral victory, by the way, I'm seeing a lot of New York billionaires coming out and basically saying, we're just not going to allow this to happen. We're going to throw a ton of money behind Mamdani's opponent. And it leads me to believe that maybe Mamdani's path to mayoral victory is probably not as clear cut as is being described right now. At any rate, there have been calls to draft AOC as a 2028 presidential candidate. I take those seriously, but not literally. I seriously doubt she's going to be the presidential candidate in 2028, although I hope she is. And then beyond that, just demands for new leadership within the Democrat Party. And you look at all that stuff and you have to come to the conclusion, I think, that democratic socialism likely has a bright future within the party. And this is almost certainly because of demographics. The boomer generation, they have been a moderating force in American politics. In 5 years, by 2030, all boomers are going to be above the age of 65. And then you look 10 years from now, and their power and influence is just going to naturally be in decline because they're aging and they're having fewer positions of power and influence. And so this process is going to reshape American politics. Without this moderating force by boomers on the left, and also I think it also applies to politics on the right, but especially on the left, younger Americans who are more amenable to socialism are going to have more influence because there will be more of them relative to the boomers. According to a 2022 Pew Research poll, 40% of Americans aged 18 to 29 say they hold favorable views of socialism. More recently, a March 2025 Cato Institute and YouGov poll found that 62% of adults aged 18 to 29 hold favorable views of socialism. And there's substantial reason to believe that socialism is again in a period of political ascendancy. This is not the first time this has happened in the United States. We had this problem of not just of socialism in general, but anarchist and socialist violence going back to the teens and into the 1920s. So let's consider this. Let's consider that two things happen by 2032, the 2032 election cycle. First, the first thing that just for this scenario, first thing we have to assume can happen is the more moderate Democrat establishment of the party has lost some power to the Democratic Socialist wing. And that has produced a viable Democratic Socialist candidate for president. Again, this is in 2032. According to the Congressional Budget Office, they project that both Social Security and Medicare will run out of money by 2032 and 2036, respectively. This is very optimistic. It is almost certainly going to happen before then. This is on top of the risk of a sovereign debt crisis, which, again, we could be looking at very easily within 10 years. So that's our first key assumption, that we're going to have some form of debt crisis or some sort of fiscal economic crisis. Our second key assumption is that by 2032, the United States is either in a period of fiscal crisis or soon to face one, and the country is embroiled in a debate on how to solve this crisis. Will it attempt to reform our capitalist system, or will it adopt a socialist future? And this is not an unrealistic scenario to believe that the 2032 presidential election could just be a de facto referendum on socialism versus capitalism. And I know the chat's going nuts on YouTube with socialism doesn't work. We know. But that doesn't mean that we can't try it again. Because it's never real socialism. It's never real communism. At any rate, last week, I wrote about legendary hedge fund manager Ray Dalio and his observations about a debt crisis, namely that throughout history, debt crises tend to produce autocratic governments because decision makers often believe that democratic consensus making is too difficult and protracted, and they have to make decisions right away. And we've seen this throughout history. Government power simply tends to expand during periods of crisis because dictating the changes that a president wants is far easier than getting those changes passed through Congress. So with this in mind, let's consider a sequence of events for how a civil war could begin in 2032 or shortly thereafter. And by the way, I bring this up because, I posted a video to YouTube. I posted Thursdays in Focus to YouTube, and there's a lot of people just saying, oh, civil war is impossible, never going to happen, not in my lifetime. You people have been saying this for 20 years, and it hasn't happened yet. And let me just say this. I think this is as realistic a scenario as we are going to see over the next several years, at least that can be foreseen. So by November 2032, in this country, in this scenario, we're facing an economic crisis because we're feeling the effects of this federal government and its unsustainable debt. And really, we're looking at the debt burden, which just will become at some point too large to manage. And so in this scenario, the Federal Reserve is printing money, quote unquote, printing money to buy up treasury bonds to fund the government. And as a result, we're seeing rising inflation, and Americans are struggling and they're looking for pain relief. It just so happens there's an election in 2032. And so the federal government is broke. Congress is split and also gridlocked. They're not able to provide any sort of solutions, even if they could. And really, Americans are no longer believing that a political solution to this crisis is possible. As is the case, these big debt crises almost always end in some form of depression, either deflationary depression like we had during the Great Depression, or an inflationary depression, which is probably what's going to happen here, because the government is probably going to have to print lots of money to buy federal debt that is going to be inflationary at a time when we have economic contraction. So we have an inflationary depression which is going to be probably like at least 10% off U.S. GDP. At any rate, that combined with severe inflation, media agitation, are already polarized politics. And the biggest thing is the loss of faith in a political solution leads to protests, riots, and routine political violence. The Democratic presidential candidate in this scenario, which is the Democratic Socialist, promises some aggressive solutions like some practical wealth redistribution, nationalization of key industries, and expanding social welfare programs to alleviate the pain. The Republican candidate, on the other hand, promises a lighter version of this, and the Democratic Socialist wins. Again, this is our 2032 scenario. It's fiction for now. In January 2033, this new president takes over, signs an executive order to implement this aggressive socialist agenda. Actually, there would be many executive orders. And this new president declares that in order to solve the government funding crisis, the United States simply needs 20 million new working taxpayers to expand the tax base, immigrants who are going to be granted amnesty and a pathway to citizenship. We're probably in a scenario where this president probably just ignores the courts. By the spring of 2033, a group of conservative states agreed to withhold federal tax payments in opposition to these new socialist policies. By the way, this actually is not fiction, because California Governor Gavin Newsom threatened to do exactly this to the Trump administration earlier this month. In this scenario, in response, this new president invokes the Insurrection Act, federalizes the National Guard in these states, and deploys the military to have these state leaders arrested after this period of protracted legal conflict is obviously not going to resolve itself. So I'm sure that this is already the plot of some prepper fiction novel, but I don't think it is unrealistic to say that this or something like this could happen in the next couple of election cycles, especially once this debt crisis actually does hit the United States government. One of the biggest takeaways from Ray Dalio's book, this latest book, How Countries Go Broke, is that governments under duress always expand their power, and they act in defense of the system, not out of what's best for the people. And that's, I think, probably a universal rule, that at a minimum, it makes our worsening low-intensity conflict more likely, but it could generate conditions that are conducive to an armed domestic conflict. It could make that more likely as well. So I present this obviously not as a prediction, just for some food for thought. If you're really struggling through how the United States could enter into a period of civil war, this is one possible scenario. And really the biggest thing is that politics in this country are going to change over the next 10 years. As the boomers, which are a moderating force on politics, begin to lose power, and they're phased out just like every generation previous. And this new batch of younger Americans are, at least say, they're far more amenable or far more favorable to socialism. This is going to change American politics. And back in 2016, when Ray Dalio said that the United States will probably have a civil war, and broadly it will probably break down between socialists and capitalists, I look at that and I say, well, that's at least a scenario that deserves some due diligence. And that is something that is not unrealistic. And that is today's In Focus. With that, Jared, let's bring you back on the show and talk about Taiwan here in just a second. But today's protests, we're counting 33 protests. That's about baseline for what we've seen on a Monday over the past several weeks. And with that, Jared.
All right, for real this time. Okay. Anyways, so Taiwan's military drafted a special budget. They do this occasionally where, outside of the normal range, they will go, hey, we want to fund additional projects here. Anyways, they drafted a special budget for up to $17 billion, which includes a potential upgrade to the Link 22 data link system. The budget also reportedly aligns Taiwan with the U.S.'s requests to Taiwan, that Taiwan shifts focus to airborne early warning platforms, missile defense, and attack helicopters. Now, why this matters. The Link 22 system would allow Taiwan to receive battlespace data from the United States Armed Forces and its allies, and constitute a functional full integration into the U.S. battle force, along with any allies that use the Link 22 system. This system is already in operation with NATO, which allows Taiwan to coordinate with numerous other allies we've been covering France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy. All of them are operating over in the Pacific. They're all part of NATO. They all use the Nile system, which NATO Imperial Link 11. That's their name for the Link 22 system. They would be able to integrate with all of them. That also means that the classification is already there, ready for Taiwan. So very quick integration. Now, this would yet again reduce China's overall relative military readiness to the region, potentially pushing back their timeline. However, I do want to point out China has heavy infiltration in Taiwan's military, extremely heavy infiltration in it. Part of the data link system to gain, a view of the battle space, that you need to have your headquarters there, and that's really where China is most heavily integrated into Taiwan. Is they capture elite. It's what they do. This poses a potentially significant threat to all U.S. and allied forces in the region, as anytime you get up on link with somebody, you know exactly where they are. So you can provide near real-time data, allowing a much more effective counter strategy for China.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, that's interesting. So this would, I remember when they first announced the F-35, one of the big warfighting improvements is the F-35 is basically just a flying sensor. I mean, it has all sorts of sensors, and it is able to talk to these battleships. It's able to basically identify aircraft or identify other things in the battle space and send that information down to a battleship that can be targeted by, I guess, artillery fire or however that works in the Navy. So this F-35 data, that's part of this Link 22 system as well.
I don't know if the F-35 has Link 22. I would have to double check to see which.
Well,
link
I bring this up because
you can see we've got 16 and 11 as well, both of which integrate pretty well into it. So you can end up sharing across all these, even if it's not directly sensor to sensor.
Okay. Well, I bring this up because the F-35 is currently, I believe, the most sensitive air platform that we have in the air right now, just in terms of sensors being able to provide targeting data to other platforms. This distributed, what do they call it? Distributed defense system. Yep. In terms of fighter capability. Yeah. So we got AWACS and we got all these different things, but in terms of actual air power. All right. So the point being is, you're saying that because China has infiltrated the Taiwanese military so heavily, that someone sitting in a TOC or whatever the Taiwanese version of a TOC or the J2 or whatever it has, could then relay this information to the Chinese military.
I think so, yes. Now, Taiwan is absolutely working through its ranks trying to get rid of all these people. So it could be that, this does actually push China's military readiness timeline back, because Taiwan is successful in removing them. But they have removed so many already that it's kind of hard to believe there aren't also numerous other ones that would, yes, go, okay, hey, screen grab, PRC buddy, hey, here's where they are right now. It's latent, but here it is. That does allow much more effective engagement from China to any kind of allied forces. There are also issues with how, I don't know how integrated Taiwan's actual computer networks are with China. If you are able to, then if you're able to actually directly integrate with that across the strait, that would pretty much give the game away for all of the allies. Mm-hmm. And that would be terrible for any kind of counter blockade.
My expectation is that this is going to have to be air gapped off of these classified systems onto some other system before it can be sent. Like SIPR and JWICS use the internet backbone, believe technically. I'll have to ask some IT S6 guy, but I'm pretty sure how that works. SIPR and JWICS are the secret and top secret platforms, and Taiwan has some equivalent, I'm sure.
Yeah. Yes. What I'm saying is, that they're so heavily integrated on everything that I don't know if any of those gaps have already been bridged. Like, if I were China, that's what I would do. I would get into absolutely every system Taiwan has, sure. Make sure it connects to something that you can go see.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right. Well, Jared, that's something that I haven't seen any of the defense blogs bring up before, so I think that's a fantastic point. All right. With that, let's go ahead and get into our questions for the day. What is the status of a part of the big beautiful bill which prohibits federal funds to be given to illegal aliens? Well, last I heard, the Senate parliamentarian said that violated, I think they call it the Bird Rule, and so my understanding is that is still out of the big beautiful bill. However, President Trump did post on social media last night and voice his opposition to this, basically saying you've got to overrule the Senate parliamentarian on this. So that I have seen, Democrats said that they wanted to read the bill, and I think that went into the very early morning hours this morning. So I'm not sure tactically minute by minute where they are, but that's my understanding of the status of that part of the big beautiful bill, which is subject to change. We'll see. On the topic of the cartels, any idea how many informants we lost?
No, that information was withheld. It was a law enforcement classification that the IG just redacted down to unclassified, so they withheld that.
Okay. Yeah, probably some terror line releasing the least sensitive part of that. All right, could the US dollar be relegated to a regional currency? Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, that at a minimum, that is the future of the dollar. It will no longer be a global reserve, and it will probably be a regional reserve. And I think that's probably the best case scenario for a lot of these currencies, like the Chinese yuan. Of course, they want to internationalize that, but they don't want to replace the dollar. And so what we'll probably see is some form of Chinese yuan that's used for external trade that will be regionalized for trade with China. But yeah, 100%. The dollar system is, and this goes back to my conversation with Michael Every, I think last month. The dollar system, as we know it, will end. The dollar's not going to zero. In the Western Hemisphere, the dollar is very likely to remain the dominant currency. In this hemisphere, it will just no longer be a global reserve currency. And I think that's an accurate expectation. How does Palantir figure into the Link 22 system? I don't know. I don't know what contracts Palantir has. But one thing that Palantir is actually very good at doing is consuming lots of data and helping an analyst find what you're looking for. Helping an analyst find the needle in the haystack, or at least making sense or being able to visualize lots of data that would otherwise just be noise. Jared, do you know if Palantir figures into the Link 22 system?
I don't, but at the same time, you've already got the entire architecture built with all of the people that are using the organic data to figure out what exactly is going on. And I haven't operated with NATO, but I've seen enough on the U.S. Navy to say that I don't think they're going to need an AI to figure that out.
All right. Yeah, and listen, I've not consumed like air-to-air battle type tactical intelligence before, so I have no idea what that looks like, so I can't give you a better answer either. All right, Ukraine President Zelensky signed a decree withdrawing his country from an international agreement banning the use of anti-personnel mines on Monday. Do you think this will change the face of war there? I mean, anti-personnel mines are defensive. Yeah. So if anything, we're probably seeing Ukraine prepare to deploy anti-personnel mines as a defensive measure during a potential ceasefire or peace deal with Russia here. I'm not sure that changes the face of that war. I think that it's probably going to be a byproduct of the ceasefire or peace agreement, whatever gets negotiated.
Yeah. It's much harder set on those lines at the end.
All right, what's more likely to come first, U.S. civil war or China-Taiwan? If China launches the war while we're busy at home, could the rest of the Pacific Alliance, led by Japan, hold back China? Well, I mean, no one knows. And listen, a civil war in the United States, I've never predicted that it will happen. Just the main thing is that baseline, we have an ongoing low-intensity conflict, which has produced fatalities and casualties here at home, at a minimum. That's our starting point. So mainly since I did that multi-part series called Breaking Down Civil War II, one of the big things is actually said the left does not actually want a civil war. They want to win the war without fighting. And that's exactly what China wants to do with Taiwan here. So, in terms of China exploiting or taking advantage of our, at a minimum, low intensity conflict here at home or potential civil war by in later this decade or at some point in the 2030s, if you go back and you read Unrestricted Warfare by these two PLA colonels, People's Liberation Army colonels, it was published back in the 1990s. They talk about using new weapons of war, and they talk about using warfighting capabilities or warfighting tools that the West, and specifically the United States, does not consider warfare. They talk about using things like earthquakes and stock market crashes and pandemics and all these forms of what we typically think of as not warfare, but using them as weapons of war. They call them new weapons of war. We can also go back and we can read that December 2020 Army Facility Security Report. It does not specifically name China, but they do say U.S. adversaries are going to use things like cyber attacks and protests and transnational criminal organizations to attack Army bases or to at least impose some sort of dilemma or hurdle for Army facility security. Transnational criminal organizations, broadly, you could say that would be a form of hybrid warfare, using criminal elements within the United States, or transnational criminal organizations like MS-13 or Tren de Aragua or whoever else is here, Hezbollah, it doesn't matter. Using these forms of TCOs and potentially terrorist organizations as new weapons of war for the Chinese. Army obviously believes that's a distinct possibility. That's why they wrote about it. Using protests. One of the things, Jared, that we have talked about is many times before is if you are China in and expecting a conflict with the United States, you want to prevent the United States from being able to mobilize and deploy. And what's one way you could do that? Through protests that restrict travel near an Army base. If soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, whatever, if they can't get onto a base due to blocked roads, traffic, whatever, then that is some form of delay that I conceivably could happen. And it conceivably could happen because we've seen this tactic used before many times, going back to probably 2015, 2016, not just 2020. So it is already a tactic. And it's not a leap to say that China could engineer something like this, some anti-war protests or however it manifests itself. So at any rate, if we're busy here at home, I think this is something that China would obviously like to see happen, especially in a time of war or a lead up of crisis into a period of war. Jared?
So I'm sorry, Summer.
That's fine.
So I'm going to work backwards a little bit here. Since January, I've been saying that I think China's going to miss this deadline and that they're not going to move on Taiwan in 27. And if they don't move on Taiwan in 27, they won't have the population to do so in the 2030s either. So I think that's actually basically not going to happen at this point, unless China just completely misassesses how everything's going. And on the second question here, could the rest of the Pacific Alliance, led by Japan, hold back China? I think yes. I don't think it would be a quick war. I don't think it would be an easy war, but I think they could, because Taiwan already is very difficult to take over. We covered that pretty extensively at the end of the last year. The premier amphibious force of basically all time said, yeah, we can't do that. It requires a 20 to 1 attack ratio, so no thank you. China just doesn't have it. And that's only Taiwan. That's not accounting for Japan, who said, yes, we will absolutely get involved. The Philippines, who said, yes, we will absolutely get involved. Australia's done the same thing at this point. So could they all do it? Yeah, I think because all they have to do, they don't have to beat China and conquer it. They just have to prevent them from landing and establishing a hold in Taiwan. That is doable. It's much easier if the United States Navy is there too. So I do think that I think to the base question, I think a civil war in the United States is more likely, just because I don't think China will move on Taiwan unless they move basically now, because
Mhm.
the longer they wait, the worse it gets for them.
What do you make of, every so often we hear these rumors bubbling up from China about Xi Jinping is losing his grip on power. And on Friday, we saw another senior PLA general replaced. The chief of the Navy, I believe, was replaced. And every so often we see these very high ranking military officials in China be replaced. And they say it's for corruption or, whatever. They'll make up charges. Who knows what it's really for? Maybe some of it may be for espionage. Who knows? Or for maybe just opposing Xi Jinping. But over the weekend, I saw that maybe there's some credibility to this, and maybe some of these more recent replacements are an attempt to uh, weaken Xi Jinping's control of the military. If there is a loss of faith by members of the Politburo or other party members, then we could see potentially Xi Jinping replaced. And again, it's not a prediction. This stuff bubbles up. You hear about this stuff kind of in a low boil all the time. Apparently, some China watchers think this may actually be credible this time. And again, there's lots of possibilities here, but I would expect that if Xi Jinping is replaced, that's probably, well, what say you? Again, we don't even know his replacement, and this is so far into the realm of speculation. I really even hesitate to get into this, but it just seems like to me that China is definitely not going to meet their 2027 deadline if this does end up happening.
Yeah. I'll try to address every point here. So, as far as replacing military leadership, that is huge. That was one of my main points back in January, saying, "Hey, I don't think they're going to reach this because China, unlike the United States military and all the militaries that are actually based off of that system, does not run with its backbone as an NCO corps, a non-commissioned officer corps." The pretty famous quote about who actually runs the military is that it's the NCOs. It's not the officers. The NCOs teach everybody here in the U.S. military. China, no, it is always top down, always top down. So you start replacing the guys that are actually going to fight the fight. Who's actually training at that point? Nobody. They're not. They're like, you will have some guys that may know how to do some things down at the tactical level, but they won't know how to actually fight the fight. That said, is there credibility to Xi Jinping's power weakening? Yes. And I say that only because structurally it's kind of like it's always going to be there. It doesn't matter who's in power. There's always that issue. One of the things that China does, they have to take their most extreme guys, basically the guys who would otherwise be ultra nationalists for China, and press them into service for the PLA. That is an issue for power there. And there's always a tension between the PLA wanting to go as hard as they can and the actual central party going, no, we need to be strategic about this. So if Xi Jinping weakens, and keep in mind, we don't need to see him be politically replaced. He's older, depending on Chinese medicine, for an ailment that I think has been going on for like 5 years now. Like he did have a health issue. He could just die. That is something I've been watching for, and had a brief period where he did not show up for like a month, like last year, and that was that was concerning because what happens next? Who takes over? If it's somebody from the PLA or very close with the PLA, then I would say, okay, guys, I don't think China can pull a win, but I think they're going to move on Taiwan. Where if it's any kind of standard politician, I would think that they push it back, especially if they're not as aggressive as Xi Jinping is. And China tends to go through these cycles. They have very aggressive national leaders, followed by people who just want to kind of maintain what it is, and then a reformer. And I would expect that we have somebody pull back and go, okay, well, we need to figure out first our demographic issue, because China has an enormous demographics issue.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I forget the exact stats, Jared, maybe you remember them, about a Chinese currency. Chinese currencies have never lasted for so many years, and we're basically like right at the tail end of that window here for China today.
I think it was like 70 to 100 years, which they're at 70. And how many, like, that was not accounting for um, how often they readjust their currency, because there were a couple of readjustments when we did that dive, like that would lead to it. But you probably know this better than me at this point. But I forget how many times the Chinese Communist Party alone has readjusted its currency. Like it seems like it's every few years. That has got to be bad for
Oh yeah, like the devaluations. Man.
it. Hmm.
All right. Well, at any rate, all this is saying there's apparently maybe there's some actual fire to the smoke this time. We'll see.
Yeah.
All right, Jared. Thanks for that. There's speaking of currency. Regarding the reserve currency, do you think everyone will want to go to a gold-backed currency? It would seem that would end up being the most stable. Well, it depends on who you ask. If you look at Ray Dalio's cycle for big debt crises, and these are like government ending debt crises, he says, yes, at some point in a fiat system, an unconstrained fiat system like we have today, the final stage of a debt crisis, which is the recovery, he says at some point you will have lenders who want a return to sound money because they want assurances that when they lend money out, it's just not going to be inflated away. The value of that currency is not going to be inflated away. And so Ray Dalio says at the end of these crises, typically what you have is either a return to sound money or a return to fiat that's managed through interest rates, where interest rate is the primary stable interest rates are the primary driver of the value of the currency. So, historically, again, you look at what happened in Weimar Germany when their central bank inflated the mark, and the central bank came in and reintroduced this new currency called the Rentenmark. And they said, hey guys, we promise we're not going to hyperinflate this one away. And the Germans believed them, and it didn't. A lot of hyperinflation has to do with actually psychology, because hyperinflation is not just severe inflation. Hyperinflation is complete loss of faith in a currency, so that as soon as you get that currency, you try to spend it for something else, because it doesn't matter what it is. It's going to be a better store of value than that currency. And so this is a case where the German central bank effectively hyperinflated one currency away, and then just introduced another one. And I believe it was still fiat. So who knows the future? There has been some talk about maybe the United States maybe returning to a gold standard. I tend to doubt that, but we'll see. But you know what? A lot of countries today that are going to experience their own sovereign debt crisis, they will probably reemerge with a hard currency, a currency that's backed to something. We'll see. Great question. So many countries are so dependent on the US dollar system. Do you think that will cause a delay in an unsolvable crisis beyond the 7 to 10-year timeline? Well, in terms of a resolution to this crisis, one of the big problems is anytime you have massive defaults is you have to go back through the legal system, right? I mean, a default, these things have to work their way through the legal system, and these courts will decide who gets paid back and in what order these people get paid back. And this can take years. So a default in some resolution to this crisis is not just going to be like, well, I don't have the money to pay back this loan, so I'm filing for bankruptcy and defaulting on this loan or whatever. And then you can't just like work your way back up. So I guess that would be one of my major considerations is the legal timeline of courts just being inundated with these types of cases. In terms of so many countries being dependent on the dollar, will that cause a delay in an unsolvable crisis? If you go back and you read Brent Johnson's stuff, he's the dollar milkshake theory guy that runs Santiago Capital. He says that it's somewhere between $30 to $50 trillion of dollar-denominated debt that the world owes itself. So, like banks in Turkey or banks in Germany or Mongolia or Peru or whatever. Okay, they issue debt that's denominated in dollars because it's a more stable currency. And so this cannot be this can't be simply a case. Brent Johnson says it can't be a case where all these countries just say, well, we're going to leave the dollar system, because they're talking about economic implosion, because they have multiple trillions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars in some cases that would just disappear. And money is debt. So when you have debt destruction, you have money destruction, which is extreme deflation. And so this is not the countries, all these countries are basically locked into the dollar system because there's so much dollar denominated debt in their own country. And if these countries were just to say, oh yeah, we're going to go for a brick-back, there's not going to be a brick-back currency, I don't think, BRICS. But if, let's just say there were, or let's say that China introduces some external trade currency that actually is backed in gold. This is not going to simply be a case where you have these BRICS plus countries say, oh yeah, we're going to leave the dollar system and we're going to go to China, because they have massive amounts of dollar denominated debt. And if that debt gets defaulted on and that debt goes to zero, you're talking about severe deflationary depression for that country. And this is not just a case that this country is going to be able to dig itself out once they leave a dollar system. So I actually agree with Brent Johnson on here that a lot of these countries are locked into the dollar system. So in terms of that causing a delay to a crisis, I don't know, I guess maybe the question's a little bit vague there on the back end, but that's something that, as long as there's international demand for the dollar, which there will have to be to pay back these dollar denominated debts, then that's one thing that the dollar is going to continue to have going for it. And I don't know if that answers your question or not. Reports of firefighters taking sniper fire in Coeur d'Alene last night. Yeah, so my understanding that situation has been resolved. I think it resolved last night. They found the guy with a gunshot wound, and last I saw, I'm not sure if it was self-inflicted or he was actually shot. But you know, my thoughts. I mean, it's in North Idaho. I think you pronounce it at Ethel or Ethel. I don't know, in Idaho. You know, that's like where a lot of those Aryan dudes went up to, and I guess to some degree they're still up there. Starting a fire and then calling 911 to report it and then attacking first responders. I mean, it's extremely unfortunate and tragic. And I don't know. Listen, I can't tell you. I don't have any thoughts on it. I don't have any good thoughts. Next question. Why is China's fifth column in the U.S. and Canada, or why is China's fifth column in the U.S. and Canada included in the analysis of China moving on Taiwan?
He did correct himself and say is not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think it should be. I think it should be, because we're talking about elite capture here, where China and this is not just happens in America, it happens all over the world. China embroils these politicians in bribes or money-making schemes, or as investors or whatever. There's some economic or financial benefit there. And then the back end of that is, well, we scratched your back. Now, you know, you got to scratch ours. And you got to do this. You got to vote this way, or oppose this bill, or oppose this certain provision, or do whatever. And so I think this is one thing. If you're China and you want to win the war without going to war, because that's the whole Sun Tzu thing, then obviously elite capture in your enemy's countries is a pretty big thing. Jared, when I look at defense blogs, I don't see them include stuff like elite capture or whatever. I see them talk about cyber attacks. And listen, one point I didn't make. When you go back and read Unrestricted Warfare, the biggest takeaway that I got from that book is that China wants to impose a strategic dilemma on the United States, where U.S. leaders can choose national survival, or they can choose Taiwan. And if China wants to win the war without going to war, you impose that kind of strategic dilemma on the United States, and you force their leaders into choosing national survival and not Taiwan, because they can't do both. So in terms of having some sort of domestic conflict, or even just like low intensity conflict, not even rising to the level of civil war in the United States, you know, I would say that has to be one factor that is considered when we look at U.S. capability to respond to Taiwan. What say you?
So I do want to clarify here at Forward Observer, we don't leave that totally out. I refuse to, because it is, you know, definitely is a factor, especially when you look at where they are. They tend to be over on the West Coast, which go figure. Um, that said, that that to me seems primarily like a disruption mechanism and not a means to actually truly prevent a war. They just don't. It's not like they have captured the president. Now, if we had a different president, then I would change that assessment. But you would have to actually capture the guy in charge of the military to say, okay, they are not deploying now. That said, if you could see something like Bremerton, Washington being captured, and now they're just not doing port ops. You can't get the ships underway. That's different, but it doesn't stop the entire Navy. It doesn't stop the Army from deploying. So it's important, but I don't think it's a primary factor in this assessment. And on top of that, as I mentioned earlier with the question, can Japan lead? Japan can lead. So yet that reduces China's fifth column in the U.S. and Canada even further. Is their fifth column over here is not going to play a role into Japan. They have their own separate issues over there, and Japan will deal with that as they see necessary. Point is, it's an important factor, but it's not a decisive factor as far as I can tell.
All right. All right, let's get to these last few questions, and then we'll call it a Monday. You think Bitcoin's value will increase as the dollar becomes more unstable? Well, I would say that Bitcoin's price in dollars will continue to increase if the dollar continues to weaken. So, yeah, for sure. I think you look at the amount of institutional backing going into crypto, and more specifically Bitcoin. Who was it? BlackRock? Last week sometime, BlackRock came out and they said, by the way, BlackRock, I believe, is the world's largest institutional money manager with probably at least 11 trillion in assets under management. They came out and they said they want to be the world's largest crypto asset manager. So I look at that as a very positive sign for crypto in general. And you look at and just full disclosure, I'm somewhat of a Bitcoin bro. I like Bitcoin. I've liked it for many years. As a matter of fact, we used to have more or less a weekly intelligence report on crypto that we ran for about a year. So yeah, I think Bitcoin price in dollars is going up. Bitcoin priced in gold or some other currency, who knows? All right, last question here. Why do we consider China's influence a fifth column and not Islam's, who's just embedded, if not more so? Well, Jared, I think there is an astounding amount of foreign influence in the U.S. government. It's not just China. It's not just Islam. And, frankly, it should be, this should be a national priority to excise foreign influence inside the United States. As with regard to why is China's influence considered a fifth column and not Islam, I guess that's who you ask, because I know a lot of people who do look at the nexus of Islam, the nexus of U.S. politicians being influenced by Islamic countries or Islamic actors, and it may not be mainstream, but I don't know. All right, is that the last question, Jared?
That is the last question.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we're getting a little outside our focus here with that question. With that, everyone, thanks so much for your support. That's going to do it for today. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show, starting at 08 Central Time. Just as a reminder, this is the week of Independence Day on Friday. We will be out on Friday. And by the way, at the end of this week, we'll be moving subscribers over from the early warning platform over to the Forward Observer platform. After Friday, next Monday, July the 7th, we will no longer be streaming the show on the Early Warning Network on YouTube. We'll be streaming it back over on the Forward Observer channel. So if you're watching us on YouTube on Monday, actually just go there today. Forward Observer on YouTube. That's where we're going to be streaming starting on Monday, July 7th. And with that, we got lots of emails explaining the details of what's going on coming out this week. So everyone, that's going to do it for today's show. Until tomorrow, be well and stay out front.